Benito Mussolini, in full Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini was born on July 29, 1883, Predappio, Italy, died April 28, 1945, near Dongo, Italian Prime Minister, 1922–43, and the first of 20th century Europe's fascist dictators. Mussolini was the first child of the local blacksmith. In later years, he expressed pride in his humble origins and often spoke of himself as a man of the people. The Mussolini family was, in fact, less humble than he claimed. His father, a part-time socialist journalist as well as a blacksmith, was the son of a lieutenant in the National Guard, and his mother was a schoolteacher, but the Mussolinis were undoubtedly poor. They lived in two crowded rooms on the second floor of a small, decrepit palazzo. Because Mussolini's father spent much of his time discussing politics in taverns and most of his money on his mistress, his three children's meals were often meager. A restless child, Mussolini was disobedient, unruly, and aggressive. He was a bully at school and moody at home. Because the teachers at the village school could not control him, he was sent to board with the strict Salesian order at Faenza, where he proved himself more troublesome than ever, stabbing a fellow pupil with a penknife and attacking one of the Salesians who had attempted to beat him. He was expelled and sent to the Giosuè Carducci school at Forlimpopoli, from which he was also expelled after assaulting yet another pupil with his penknife. He was also intelligent, and he passed his final examinations without difficulty. He obtained a teaching diploma and worked as a schoolmaster for a while, but soon realized that he was totally unsuited for such work. At 19, a short, pale young man with a powerful jaw and enormous, dark, piercing eyes, he left Italy for Switzerland with a nickel medallion of Karl Marx in his otherwise empty pockets. For the next few months, according to his own account, he lived from day to day, jumping from job to job. At the same time, however, he was gaining a reputation as a young man of strange magnetism and remarkable rhetorical talents. He read widely and voraciously, if not deeply, plunging into the philosophers and theorists Immanuel Kant, Benedict de Spinoza, Peter Kropotkin, Friedrich Nietzsche, G.W.F. Hegel, Karl Kautsky, and Georges Sorel, picking out what appealed to him and discarding the rest, forming no coherent political philosophy of his own, yet impressing his companions as a potential revolutionary of uncommon personality and striking presence. While earning a reputation as a political journalist and public speaker, he produced propaganda for a trade union, proposing a strike and advocating violence to enforce demands. Repeatedly, he called for a day of vengeance. More than once, he was arrested and imprisoned. When he returned to Italy in 1904, even the Roman newspapers started to mention his name. For some time after his return, little was heard of him. He once more became a schoolmaster, this time in the Venetian Alps, north of Udine, where he lived, so he confessed, a life of moral deterioration. But soon tiring of so wasteful a life, he returned to trade union work, journalism, and extreme politics, which led to arrest and imprisonment. During a period of freedom in 1909, he fell in love with 16-year-old Rachel Guidi, the younger of the two daughters of his father's widowed mistress. She went to live with him in a damp, cramped apartment in Forlì and later married him. Soon after the marriage, Mussolini was imprisoned for the fifth time, but by then, Comrade Mussolini had become recognized as one of the most gifted and dangerous of Italy's younger socialists. After writing in a wide variety of socialist papers, he founded a newspaper of his own, La Lotta di Classe, The Class Struggle. So successful was this paper that in 1912 he was appointed editor of the official socialist newspaper, Avanti! Forward, whose circulation he soon doubled, and as its anti-militarist, anti-nationalist, and anti-imperialist editor, he thunderously opposed Italy's intervention in World War I. Soon, however, he changed his mind about intervention. Swayed by Karl Marx's aphorism that social revolution usually follows war and persuaded that the defeat of France would be a death blow to liberty in Europe, he began writing articles and making speeches as violently in favor of war as those in which he previously had condemned it. He resigned from Avanti! And was expelled from the Socialist Party. Financed by the French government and Italian industrialists, both of whom favored war against Austria, he assumed the editorship of Il Popolo d'Italia, the people of Italy, in which he unequivocally stated his new philosophy: from today onward we are all Italians and nothing but Italians. Now that steel has met steel, one single cry comes from our hearts: Viva l'Italia! Long live Italy! It was the birth cry of fascism. Mussolini went to fight in the war. How did Mussolini rise to power? Wounded while serving with the Bersaglieri, a corps of sharpshooters, he returned home a convinced anti-socialist and a man with a sense of destiny. As early as February 1918, he advocated the emergence of a dictator, a man who is ruthless and energetic enough to make a clean sweep to confront the economic and political crisis then gripping Italy. 3 months later, in a widely reported speech in Bologna, he hinted that he himself might prove to be such a man. The following year, the nucleus of a party prepared to support his ambitious idea was formed in Milan. In an office in Piazza San Sepolcro, about 200 assorted Republicans, anarchists, syndicalists, discontented socialists, restless revolutionaries, and discharged soldiers met to discuss the establishment of a new force in Italian politics. Mussolini called this force the Fasci di Combattimento, fighting bands, groups of fighters bound together by ties as close as those that secured the fasces of the lictors, the symbols of ancient Roman authority. So fascism was created and its symbol devised. At rallies surrounded by supporters wearing black shirts, Mussolini caught the imagination of the crowds. His physique was impressive, and his style of oratory, staccato and repetitive, was superb. His attitudes were highly theatrical, his opinions were contradictory, his facts were often wrong, and his attacks were frequently malicious and misdirected, but his words were so dramatic, his metaphors so apt and striking, his vigorous, repetitive gestures so extraordinarily effective, that he rarely failed to impose his mood. Fascist squads, militias inspired by Mussolini but often created by local leaders, swept through the countryside of the Po Valley in the Puglian Plains, rounded up socialists, burned down union and party offices, and terrorized the local population. Hundreds of radicals were humiliated, beaten, or killed. In late 1920, the black shirt squads, often with the direct help of landowners, began to attack local government institutions and prevent left-wing administrations from taking power. Mussolini encouraged the squads, although he soon tried to control them and organized similar raids in and around Milan. By late 1921, the fascists controlled large parts of Italy, and the left, in part because of its failures during the post-war years, had all but collapsed. The government, dominated by middle-class liberals, did little to combat this lawlessness, both through weak political will and a desire to see the mainly working class left defeated. As the fascist movement built a broad base of support around the powerful ideas of nationalism and anti-Bolshevism, Mussolini began planning to seize power at the national level. In the summer of 1922, Mussolini's opportunity presented itself. The remnants of the trade union movement called a general strike. Mussolini declared that unless the government prevented the strike, the fascists would. Fascist volunteers, in fact, helped to defeat the strike and thus advanced the fascist claim to power. At a gathering of 40,000 fascists in Naples on October 24, Mussolini threatened, "Either the government will be given to us, or we will seize it by marching on Rome." Responding to his oratory, the assembled fascists excitedly took up the cry, shouting in unison, "Roma! Roma! Roma!" All appeared eager to march. Later that day, Mussolini and other leading fascists decided that 4 days later the fascist militia would advance on Rome in converging columns led by 4 leading party members, later to be known as the Quadriumviri. Mussolini himself was not one of the 4. He was still hoping for a political compromise, and he refused to move before King Victor Emmanuel III summoned him in writing. Meanwhile, all over Italy the fascists prepared for action, and the march on Rome began. Although it was far less orderly than fascist propaganda later suggested, it was sufficiently threatening to bring down the government. And the king, prepared to accept the fascist alternative, dispatched the telegram for which Mussolini had been waiting. Mussolini's obvious pride in his achievement at becoming, October 31, 1922, the youngest prime minister in Italian history, was not misplaced. He had certainly been aided by a favorable combination of circumstances, both political and economic, but his remarkable and sudden success also owed something to his own personality, to native instinct and shrewd calculation, to astute opportunism, and to his unique gifts as an agitator. Anxious to demonstrate that he was not merely the leader of fascism but also the head of a united Italy, he presented to the king a list of ministers, a majority of whom were not members of his party. He made it clear, however, that he intended to govern authoritatively. He obtained full dictatorial powers for a year, and in that year he pushed through a law that enabled the fascists to cement a majority in the parliament. The elections in 1924, though undoubtedly fraudulent, secured his personal power. Many Italians, especially among the middle class, welcomed his authority. They were tired of strikes and riots, responsive to the flamboyant techniques and medieval trappings of fascism, and ready to submit to dictatorship, provided the national economy was stabilized and their country restored to its dignity. Mussolini seemed to them the one man capable of bringing order out of chaos. Soon a kind of order had been restored, and the fascists inaugurated ambitious programs of public works. The costs of this order were, however, enormous. Italy's fragile democratic system was abolished in favor of a one-party state. Opposition parties, trade unions, and the free press were outlawed. Free speech was crushed. A network of spies and secret policemen watched over the population. This repression hit moderate liberals and Catholics as well as socialists. In 1924, Mussolini's henchmen kidnapped and murdered the socialist deputy Giacomo Matteotti, who had become one of fascism's most effective critics in parliament. The Matteotti crisis shook Mussolini, but he managed to maintain his hold on power. Mussolini was hailed as a genius and a superman by public figures worldwide. His achievements were considered little less than miraculous. He had transformed and reinvigorated his divided and demoralized country. He had carried out his social reforms and public works without losing the support of the industrialists and landowners. He had even succeeded in coming to terms with the papacy. The reality, however, was far less rosy than the propaganda made it appear. Social divisions remained enormous, and little was done to address the deep-rooted structural problems of the Italian state and economy. Mussolini might have remained a hero until his death had not his callous xenophobia and arrogance, his misapprehension of Italy's fundamental necessities, and his dreams of empire led him to seek foreign conquests. His eye rested first upon Ethiopia, which, after 10 months of preparations, rumors, threats, and hesitations, Italy invaded in October 1935. A brutal campaign of colonial conquest followed, in which the Italians dropped tons of gas bombs upon the Ethiopian people. Europe expressed its horror, but, having done so, did no more. The League of Nations imposed sanctions but ensured that the list of prohibited exports did not include any, such as oil, that might provoke a European war. If the League had imposed oil sanctions, Mussolini said, he would have had to withdraw from Ethiopia within a week. But he faced no such problem, and on the night of May 9, 1936, he announced to an enormous, expectant crowd of about 400,000 people standing shoulder to shoulder around Piazza Venezia in Rome that in the 14th year of the fascist era a great event had been accomplished: Italy had its empire. This moment probably marked the peak of public support for the regime. Italy had also found a new ally intent upon his own imperial ambitions in Austria. Adolf Hitler had actively encouraged Mussolini's African adventure, and under Hitler's guidance Germany had been the one powerful country in Western Europe that had not turned against Mussolini. The way was now open for the Pact of Steel, a Rome-Berlin Axis, and a brutal alliance between Hitler and Mussolini that was to ruin them both. In 1938, following the German example, Mussolini's government passed anti-Semitic laws in Italy that discriminated against Jews in all sectors of public and private life and prepared the way for the deportation of some 20% of Italy's Jews to German death camps during the war. Mussolini's role in World War II. While Mussolini understood that peace was essential to Italy's well-being, that a long war might prove disastrous, and that he must not march blindly with the Germans, he was beset by concerns that the Germans might do good business cheaply, and that by not intervening on their side in World War II he would lose his part of the booty. His foreign secretary and son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano, recorded that during a long, inconclusive discussion at the Palazzo Venezia, Mussolini at first agreed that Italy must not go to war, then he said that honor compelled him to march with Germany. Mussolini watched the progress of Hitler's war with bitterness and alarm, becoming more and more bellicose with each fresh German victory, while frequently expressing hope that the Germans would be slowed down or would meet with some reverse that would satisfy his personal envy and give Italy breathing space. When Germany advanced westward, however, and France seemed on the verge of collapse, Mussolini felt he could delay no longer. So, on June 10, 1940, the fateful declaration of war was made. From the beginning, the war went badly for Italy, and Mussolini's opportunistic hopes for a quick victory soon dissolved. France surrendered before there was an opportunity for even a token Italian victory, and Mussolini left for a meeting with Hitler, sadly aware, as Ciano put it, that his opinion had only a consultative value. Indeed, from then on, Mussolini was obliged to face the fact that he was the junior partner in the Axis alliance. The Germans kept the details of most of their military plans concealed, presenting their allies with a fait accompli for fear that prior discussion would destroy surprise. Thus, the Germans made such moves as the occupation of Romania and the later invasion of the Soviet Union without any advance notice to Mussolini. It was to pay back Hitler in his coin, as Mussolini openly admitted, that he decided to attack Greece through Albania in 1940 without informing the Germans. The result was an extensive and ignominious defeat, and the Germans were forced unwillingly to extricate him from its consequences. The 1941 campaign to support the German invasion of the Soviet Union also failed disastrously and condemned thousands of ill-equipped Italian troops to a nightmarish winter retreat. Hitler had to come to his allies' help again in North Africa. After the Italian surrender in North Africa in 1943, the Germans began to take precautions against a likely Italian collapse. Mussolini had grossly exaggerated the extent of public support for his regime and the war. When the Western Allies successfully invaded Sicily in July 1943, it was evident that collapse was imminent. For some time Italian fascists and non-fascists alike had been preparing Mussolini's downfall. On July 24, at a meeting of the Fascist Grand Council, the supreme constitutional authority of the state, which had not met once since the war began, an overwhelming majority passed a resolution that, in effect, dismissed Mussolini from office. Disregarding the vote as a matter of little concern and refusing to admit that his minions could harm him, Mussolini appeared at his office the following day as though nothing had happened. That afternoon, however, he was arrested by royal command on the steps of the Villa Savoia after an audience with the king. Imprisoned first on the island of Ponza, then on a remoter island off the coast of Sardinia, he was eventually transported to a hotel high on the Gran Sasso d'Italia in the mountains of Abruzzi, from which his rescue by the Germans was deemed impossible. Nevertheless, by crash-landing gliders on the slopes behind the hotel, a German commandos led by Waffen-SS officer Otto Skorzeny on September 12, 1943, effected his escape by air to Munich. Rather than allow the Germans to occupy and govern Italy entirely in their interests, Mussolini agreed to Hitler's suggestion to establish a new fascist government in the north and execute those members of the Grand Council, including his son-in-law, Ciano, who had dared to vote against him. But the Repubblica Sociale Italiana thus established at Salo was, as Mussolini himself grimly admitted to visitors, no more than a puppet government at the mercy of the German command. And there, living in dreams and thinking only of history and how he would appear in it, as one of his ministers said, Mussolini awaited the inevitable end. Meanwhile, Italian fascists maintained their alliance with the Germans and participated in deportations, the torture of suspected partisans, and the war against the Allies. As German defenses in Italy collapsed and the Allies advanced rapidly northward, the Italian communists of the partisan leadership decided to execute Mussolini. Rejecting the advice of various advisors, including the elder of his two surviving sons, his second son had been killed in the war. Mussolini refused to consider flying out of the country, and he made for the Valtellina, intending perhaps to make a final stand in the mountains. Still, only a handful of men could be found to follow him. He tried to cross the frontier disguised as a German soldier in a convoy of trucks retreating toward Innsbruck, in Austria. But he was recognized and, together with his mistress, Claretta Petacci, who had insisted on remaining with him to the end, he was shot and killed on April 28, 1945. Their bodies were hung, head downward, in the Piazza Loreto in Milan. Huge jubilant crowds celebrated the fall of the dictator and the end of the war. The great mass of the Italian people greeted Mussolini's death without regret. He had lived beyond his time and had dragged his country into a disastrous war, which it was unwilling and unready to fight. Democracy was restored in the country after 20 years of dictatorship, and a neo-fascist party that carried on Mussolini's ideals won only 2% of the vote in the 1948 elections. Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If so, hit or smash the subscribe button and turn on notification to be the first person to be notified whenever we post a new video. Your subscription won't be taken for granted.